Clerk would read item A, please.
Ordinance to amend selected sections of the Land Development Ordinance specifically for the tree committee, tree permit, and tree protection.
Thank you. Here's what I'd like to do. This is a special meeting, and what I'd like to have done. I know that Mr. Nolan said that he has a PowerPoint. How many slides? You told me 3 earlier. Okay. He has some slides, and then we have some representatives from the tree committee, and there's a handout that the tree committee prepared that I put in front of you. And what I'm trying to do is just streamline the meeting a little bit. There's a lot of verbiage and a lot of text and everything, but basically there are just several points that are going to change, and the council would like to know what are they and then what the implications are. We may take action on that today or not. But we'll start, Mr. Nolan, with you, please. Thank you.
All right, I tried to break it down to the few things that we're trying to change in the ordinance. Basically going over what will be protected, what's exempted, and then some other details. So first thing that will be protected with the changes in the ordinance now that we're proposing would be live oaks, bald cypress, southern magnolia at 8 inches in diameter when measured 4.5 feet above the ground. And any other non-protected species 16 inches or larger in diameter. So that would be if we have let's say we have a really big willow oak that's in really good shape and it's over 16 inches in diameter, it's going to be protected also. They would have to get a permit for it. That we would still issue the permit for removal if they had some structural flaws or that kind of thing, but they would have to at least come to us. Trees that would never require a permit would be any variety of pecan, Chinese tallow or popcorn trees, water oaks, or any of the trees in the pine species, which down here is a loblolly, shortleaf, or a slash.
Hang on just a moment. I want to write real quick. Thank you, Eric.
Okay.
Continue.
We're proposing changes to the mitigation requirements. Currently, the mitigation is a 3-to-1 mitigation. We're proposing to change it to a table based on the size of the tree that you're removing. So if you look there, 8 to 12 inch tree would be 2, and then as the diameters increase, the requirement for a replacement tree would increase. You would have to do 3 replacement trees, 4 replacement trees, 5, and 6.
And that part there, is that for everything?
That's for, no, the only trees that would have to be mitigated are for commercial properties.
Okay.
And we're also discussing possibly for residential subdivisions, meeting that table also.
All right, so the first one is strictly for commercial.
Yeah, mainly it's dealing with your commercial stuff.
Okay.
We're establishing a mitigation trust. In lieu of planting on site, the developer can donate to the mitigation trust to aid in planting projects around the city. Mitigation costs will be the local market rate times 2. So say somebody cuts down let's go back to the mitigation table. Let's say somebody cuts down hold on, dragging on me. Somebody cuts down a 17-inch oak tree, is required to do 3 replacement trees. If they don't want to plant the 3 replacement trees, they would have to pay mitigation costs in, which is 3 replacement trees times 2. So that would be your mitigation money that you would put into the mitigation trust. Next is the cities around the coast that also have mitigation. Ocean Springs, Gulfport, Ocean Springs, Long Beach, Pass Christiana, and Bay St. Louis all require a 1-for-1 replacement on, if you cut a tree down, you have to mitigate it with one replacement tree. Gulfport is a little different in that it only requires a mitigation tree if your density falls below 1 for every 1,000 square feet of lot. And Gulfport's only deals with commercial, multifamily, industrial, and residential lots over 1 acre. So your main small lots and subdivisions do not qualify.
Do you have a printout of that for the council?
I just finished it right before the meeting. I'll get copies of it and I'll bring it into you right after I finish this.
Mr. Nolan, do you know if anyone has a tree mitigation bank in the state of
Nobody
Mississippi?
that I saw.
Okay,
It's kind of a new idea.
good.
And that's the specifics of that. I wanted to go over a case that we just recently looked at. Eula Street is proposing to put in a development. The developer's proposing to remove 13 trees. Currently, the mitigation for that site would be 39 replacement trees. Using the mitigation table, based on the size of the trees removed, the mitigation would be 50 replacement trees. If we used what was originally proposed in the ordinance, they would only be required to do 13 mitigation trees. And there's the table showing the current, the mitigation table, and then a 1-for-1. And then there's the site. It's out on Eula Street, right off of DeBees. It's an old drive going into where an old apartment complex used to be, right next to the old right next to the Jeff Davis campus of Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College. And that's what the site looks like right now.
Okay, I have a question on the mitigation trust, the local market rate times 2.
Okay?
So if I'm cutting down, let's make it simple, 3 oaks of pick a size, it doesn't make any difference, 3 live oaks. So I'm going to purchase, when somebody's got to tell me how much I've got to pay, I'm looking at replacing what was cut down with that same type of tree?
Right?
Okay.
So just for example, say you're cutting down 3 10-inch live oak trees. You would be required to, by the mitigation table, 8 to 12 inches, you would be required to put in, you would be required 6 mitigation trees. So the cost of 6 mitigation trees times 2 would be what you put in the mitigation bank,
All right.
if you chose not to plant them.
And that would be, if it was a live oak, that would be the cost of 12
If it's a protected tree that you remove,
live oaks. And again, I ask because I know dollars and cents, that concerns some of my colleagues up here as well as myself. And so if I'm going to get these live oak replacements, I've got to pay for 6 of them, you said, or
2-inch caliber tree is going to run you,
live oak, right?
live oak is going to run you probably 120, 150.
So if I'm knocking down 3 of those trees, I've got to pay the mitigation bank 6. If it's $100 a tree, it's going to be $720 roughly, give or take. The market rate changes,
Right.
and that's just for commercial properties. We're not talking about a homeowner
It would deal with commercial,
subdivision.
subdivisions, multifamily, and industrial.
Okay, multifamily. So that might be in a residential area.
An apartment complex.
Okay, all right. Any other questions at this point of Mr. Nolan? If not,
One quick one.
I'll get to you.
You're taking down these trees, you charge the people to put trees back up. What it's going to do to the canopy of the city of Biloxi? The overall tree growth, the canopy itself, you steady taking down these bigger trees and replacing them, okay, but you're replacing a little old tree. So how far apart are we of having pretty much the same shade and cover and the growth if you just keep removing that many trees?
Okay.
I know that some of the main questions when we talked about this last week had to do with reestablishing the tree canopy. And I just want to emphasize that with the 3-to-1 ratio that we're already requiring in our ordinance for these commercial properties that Eric just named, we're already exceeding all of the cities around us who are only doing 1-to-1. We're requiring 3-to-1. And the fact that the tree committee can recommend, I mean, part of their responsibility is to recommend to the administration where these replacement trees need to go. Those trees can actually go into areas where maybe the canopy has been damaged in the past and reestablish that canopy in there. Now, are those trees going to grow up overnight? No, that's not going to happen. But we're talking long-term that those trees could go in the right places and help along the streetscapes where trees have been lost due to hurricanes and those kind of things. Also on the city properties, Hiller Park and the cemeteries and places like that, all of our other parks, we'd make sure that they're going into the right place. We're not challenging that. We're not challenging the 3-to-1 ratio, although that's more than what the neighboring cities require. The only thing that we changed in our recommendation is the recommendation for the new subdivisions that are going in, where if you're familiar with construction, you know how when they're clearing property for a subdivision and how they have to reshape the drainage and put in the sewer lines, water lines, and all those things, the roads going in, is that sometimes they have to almost totally reshape the landscape there to make sure that that drainage flows the right way and that those things can go in. And, you know, there was some concern about, well, you know, a contractor that's putting in a subdivision is not going to worry about the cost of replacing a few trees. But let's just say that on that subdivision that we have to take down 300 trees. That means the replacement ratio at 3-to-1 would be 900 trees. And that's when you get up into the cost where developers and contractors really start to consider whether or not they can do that project. So I think the advantages here is that with the 3-to-1 ratio, we can reestablish that tree canopy for years to come by making sure those trees go in the right locations that we think it gives us the tree canopy again. And the compromise would be with the single-family subdivisions. Does that mean that the new subdivision developers are not going to plant trees? No, they're just going to do it at the same rate that our neighboring cities do. So that's really all I have to say.
Mr. Damon.
Jerry, you may answer this, or Mr. Nolan may be able to answer this more adequately. The ordinance, where does it require that the new trees are planted? Who, the mitigation trees, where do they go? You may have said it, he may have said it, I may have missed it.
I'm sorry, what was that question?
The mitigation trees, the 3-to-1, if someone cuts a tree down, then they've got to either plant the 3 that he talked about, the price, where do those go?
The replacement trees?
Do they have to be on that parcel, that property?
Okay, theoretically, the trees should be planted on the same piece of property. But what we get into is a situation like with the new Hyatt place that came in, where they removed 300 trees. There was no way they could plant 300 trees back on that property because you get, with parking and route competition and everything else, it would never work. So what happens is the developer, when it's physically impossible for him to plant that number of trees on the property, whatever number he has to mitigate, he would basically pay into the mitigation trust that we're establishing in the changes to this ordinance. And then once that money goes into the trust, then the tree committee recommends to the city where they believe those replacement trees need to go, and then we come to the city council to get y'all to release the money from the trust so that when it gets tree planting time, we can take care of getting those trees planted.
Okay, let me follow up on that one first. If the developer doesn't want to mitigate the trees, then they have to pay twice the amount. Now, what if, like the Hyatt, they can't put them on their property? Do they have to pay twice the amount because they can't?
If they can't put them on there, the mitigation would be the same as what's on the chart in there.
They can't put them on their property.
They can't put them on their property, so they would pay the rate that's in the table that's in the packet there.
And my question is, he said that if they're not willing to do the replacement trees, they basically pay twice the cost of the trees.
Right.
Now, in the example with the Hyatt, they could not physically do that. They couldn't mitigate them on their property. Would they then still have to pay twice the mitigating trees cost? or would they pay just one cost? One times the tree instead of two times the tree? Do you see the question?
In that kind of example, what would happen? In that kind of example, what would happen was, if you're building a hotel, and you cut down a bunch of trees to build the hotel, you're going to have some landscaping that you put back in. So we would count all those trees as the way the mitigation table counts. So you would put those in, and then any of the remaining things you would have to add into the mitigation bank for the stuff that you can't plant.
So the question is, if you can't plant it, not if you, the statement was if they don't want to plant it, they'd have to pay twice. So I'm asking is don't want equate to can't? If they can't plant it, so you cut 300 trees down to build a hotel, it's not choose not to, you can't, right? So if they can't do it, does that fall in the same category as choose not to? That's what I'm asking. If it's physically impossible to put the same amount of trees back on the property, do they then have to pay twice the cost of this mitigating table?
Well, they would be held to that table regardless, but we've not run into that because most of the development that we have in there, landscaping is a big part of it, and the hotel that was built, the Hyatt place that we're talking about right now, they knew that those trees that they had out there contributed to looking established on that piece of property. So they saved as many of the trees as they could while still having to meet our parking requirements, the ordinance parking requirements for the number of rooms that they had in the hotel there. If someone chooses, I don't want any trees on this piece of property, we just want it to be clear cut from one end to the other. And if that gets approved, when it goes for their hearing before the Planning Commission, they would still be held to the mitigation formula ratio that's in the book.
So I still haven't gotten my answer to the question. So the ratio that they're being held to, if they can't put those mitigating trees back on their property, not don't want to, if they can't, are they then charged double as if they didn't want to put them back on their property?
Mitigation is mitigation. Whether you put it back on the property or whether you pay into the bank, it's going to be the same ratio.
I've got a question, not that it happens in Biloxi, but it has happened, when somebody said, cut the damn thing down, I'll worry about the fine. Okay, what teeth do we have about, that? Somebody, some contractor said, well, my owner, or, who employed me, go cut it down, I'll worry about a fine. I'd rather pay the $2,000. What teeth do we have there from a fine, not just a big building permit? I'm just going to go do it. You cut a big oak tree down, it's down. Mitigation is nothing. I mean, there's some overt act. I'm going to remove this oak tree, and what do we do in this ordinance? What teeth do we have in this ordinance?
What we could do, we could still go ahead and take it to court, just, for them to fine them, but the judge can also require them to comply with the mitigation bank that we're establishing now. Right now, we don't have a mitigation bank. So essentially, the judge is held to just what's on the ordinance right now, which is to fine them for taking the tree down. But the creation of this mitigation bank is going to open the door for us not only to fine the person that takes down that tree, but also gives the judge the teeth to make sure that they pay the mitigation fee so that we're getting 3 to 1.
So if they can't, so to answer my question, if they can't put that many mitigation trees on their property, then they're charged double what the table says.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Just to help me understand this table, because I'm just working with these slides, the current mitigation is 3 to 1. Then the diameter of the tree creates a number of mitigating trees, right? So if it's an 8 to 12 inch tree, they have to do 2. So is it then 6 because it's 3 to 1?
That's correct, yes.
Wow, okay. Thank you.
Okay, I have one question.
Mr. Guines and then Mr. Lawrence, I'll give you a shot.
Okay, and mine may be something you answered already. I'm looking at this other pamphlet. Water oaks are one of the protected species. Why was it removed?
I'm going to let Eric answer that because it has to do with the way they rot.
We chose to remove water oaks from the protected actually, in our current ordinance, all oaks and all magnolias are protected, but we chose to remove water oaks from that because water oaks take up about 80% of the tree removal permits that I do now, and when they're over 16 inches in diameter, they get a sarcophic root rot, they get a heart rot in them, the tops start dying back, and they become a hazard really quick. So we decided that there were some better things to focus our gaze on, which was protecting the live oaks and the southern magnolias and the bald cypresses, so that we're not shooting with a shotgun. We're trying to be a little bit more precise in our protections.
Mr. Lawrence?
Does the size of the water oaks mean anything, if they 16, 18, 20 inches?
For water oaks,
Yeah.
pines, pecans, and what was the last one?
Popcorn.
Popcorn, doesn't matter. Those 4 species get exempt from the ordinance altogether, so they're not protected in the city of Biloxi.
So the size of those doesn't matter?
Size doesn't matter for water oak, for any of those 4 species.
That means you don't have to mitigate for those 4?
You don't have to mitigate for them, you don't have to get a permit for them, you don't have to come see me.
Okay. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Well, I was just on, but they were on there. You just took it off, right?
We took water oaks out of the ordinance altogether, yes, sir.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Robert, you have something?
Just for simplicity, should we not just change this table for 8 to 12 and make it 6, and 13 to 17 make it 9, 12, 15, and 18 trees, just instead of having to start doing trigonometry and calculus to figure out how many trees you have to.
We didn't want to penalize the developer that decides to plant on his site. If he wants to plant back on his site 2 trees if he removes a 10-inch tree and wants to plant 2, he doesn't put any money in.
So the 3 to 1 doesn't apply to him if he plants back on his site?
It does not apply if he plants on site.
Okay.
See, he doesn't have to do, if he plants on site, the mitigation trees for the removals, he doesn't put any money in the mitigation bank. The bank is only for those trees that he can't or won't or is unwilling to put on his property.
So what does the 3 to 1, 3 for 1 mean?
3 to 1 is what the current ordinance has. It'll change from a 3 to 1 to a sliding scale based on diameter that you remove.
All right, I got you.
All right, so I have a question. So who would, I'm a developer, I'm building a hotel, I gotta knock down 40 trees. I have room where I come to you, does somebody approve the landscape plan?
Well, the first thing would happen, when he would do a survey of the site and do a tree survey. He'd come to DRC. At that point, we would take a look at the trees and the diameters, and we'd tell him, this is what your mitigation numbers are gonna be for the site. A big hotel, it's gonna have a bunch of landscaping on it.
Right.
I mean, they just do, so.
I got that. I'm going back to Mr. Deming's thought was that, well, if I build my hotel and I have some room and I plant however many I took down at whatever the ratio is, then I'm good. I don't have to worry about it. And my thought is, if it's, say, a 2-inch caliper oak tree, I'm just going to plant them 4 feet apart over here because it's cheaper for me to do that. Whichever ones live, great. Whichever ones croak, doesn't bother me. Whatever. That's the cheapest thing for me to do. In a perfect world, and it's not a perfect world, I'd say everybody pays into the mitigation bank, because somebody's got to, when you mitigate, somebody's got to go purchase the trees, I'm assuming transport the trees or have them delivered. A site has to be determined where they're going to be planted, and it's not as easy as it would appear, because you're trying to look 25 years down the road. You don't want to plant live oaks here, and 20 years later the power company's coming along and trimming the limbs or whatever. And then somebody's got to be, in a perfect world, care and feed those trees so that they survive. And one of my concerns is that, if I'm a developer and let's look at the trees, do the calculations, what's the number, I'll write a check for that. it's clean, whatever it is. Now the burden falls on the city. Good, we got this money, it goes in the mitigation bank. Now, when we have to have we want to plant some trees, I'll use by the IP, where you get on I-110 from Bayview, there was a big tree down that was on a fence, it's removed. So, yeah, maybe you could plant a live oak there. Well, somebody from the city, or you've got a contract with somebody to plant that live oak there, then somebody's got to go check it every once in a while. All those things that you're looking to do, and that costs something, that could be paid for out of that mitigation trust. And somebody's got to irrigate it or something. I mean, you're trying to get the tree to grow. So in a perfect world, that's what I would do. That's what I'd like to see. But I know, just in going to planning commission meetings, everybody worries about the cost. Everybody, when we talk about abatements in here, you know, I can remember we're going through, what would that abatement be? Well, if I can't get this abatement, I can't build this $2 million project. What does the abatement amount to? $1,800 or $2,500. You're gonna, as Mr. Lawrence once said, that much money and you're not gonna build it. You got $2 million to build a project, another $2,800, you're not gonna get a revenue, you know, that kind of stuff. So, not everybody can put trees on their property, but people look to gain the system, and that's, I guess that's what I'm looking at from a developer's point of view. I think 3-to-1 is reasonable. As I said last week, if we're losing canopy and over time somebody's bearing the cost of that, it's either going to be the developer or the community or the citizens of Biloxi in its simplest form. So right now the mitigation ratio is 3-to-1. That's not what everybody else does.
Do not object. Anything from 8 inches.
Right.
Part 3, that would be.
Right. And I would assume, an answer to just a comment associated with Mr. Deming's observation, you know, why don't you just change the number of trees to, 6, 9, 16, so you don't have to do the trigonometry?
Well,
I'm thinking
ideally,
you're going to have a form where you fill it in and what the cost is, and everybody signs off on it, then write the check and you're good to go.
ideally, you want them to plant as much as they can back on their property so that we're not responsible for it.
No,
But if
got
they
that.
do have to use the mitigation bank, we wanted it to not be punitive in nature to the point that it would hinder any kind of development.
right. And I'm thinking where it really gets into some bucks, I guess, is when you're doing developments like maybe apartment complexes, depending on the size of that, or big subdivisions. And I know it's easier just to go in and bulldoze everything, but that's a lot of greenery and trees you lose.
Most of the projects that we have coming forward and that we've dealt with, they want landscaping to be a big part of their development. You know, they do put in attractive landscaping because if it's attractive, it's going to draw more people into that hotel or whatever. But remember, with the mitigation money, if we decided to go, well, let's just make everybody pay into the mitigation bank, then it opens a door for them not to have to replace as many trees on their property. And the money in the mitigation trust can only be used to put trees on city-owned property, not on private property. So that's part of the consideration here.
Okay, Mr. Lawrence?
Jerry, one quick question. I know you're talking about trees and everything, but these people who do bushes and shrubbery is way cheaper. My problem going back to the trees, 3.5 years from now, them trees that they plant, how do we know if they're all alive? Who does all that? Who follows up on all this stuff?
The city arborist, under the ordinance, the city arborist is
Every tree
supposed
that they plant, he watches every.
it's his responsibility to monitor those trees for 3 years.
Okay, and what you do, make them replant?
If they die, that's what the ordinance says, they have to replant them. Yes.
So, you know, we never heard anything about them trees actually growing, getting bigger. You know, you're talking about 25, 30 years before it does anything. So main thing is you gotta make sure they plant it and you watch them.
Keith.
I go around, I have a list of certificate of occupancies when they're issued, and I go around and inspect them for the first 3 years of the development to check the landscaping.
And how many of those you have made them replant? Do you have any idea? That the tree failed or whatever, so you made them put back. Do you have any idea? Or just get the information back to the council?
I can get that.
Thank you.
Okay, what I'd like to do right now is if we have somebody from the tree committee, now we had a handout, just let you review your handout and then kind of be sure we all understand where we're headed with this and,
Gary, I don't know if you have a copy of this. I gave you.
and then we'll make a decision. I mean, we can vote on this today since it's a special meeting, or if you'd prefer to just listen without a vote and then add it to the next council agenda for approval.
While we're waiting for her, just to be clear, I prefer, and don't let me speak for anyone else, but I'd prefer to wait to allow Mr. Barrett and Mr. Glavin to be part of the vote.
Yeah, okay, and I'm good with that. Look at, based on what we learned today, maybe put this on the next council agenda, which would be Tuesday of next week. Is that okay with everybody? Okay. And Mr. Glavin and Mr. Barrett on here, so that's good. All right, Ms. Wyman, go ahead.
I have a couple questions for Eric, and I have a couple points I wanted to clarify regarding Mr. Deming's questions. And for the sake of the PowerPoint being right there on the slide that I was going to address, I thought we'd start there. So can we do that?
My fault.
Eric, you were the perfect gentleman until this very moment.
And so what I'm going to talk about is the mitigation table that's being proposed, okay? It's really quite simple, and it's shown here on the second page of what I gave you on that right-hand column, and it's right there. So it's just if you remove an 8 to 12-inch tree, then you're required to mitigate at a rate of 2 to 1. That's what the 2 is. And so larger tree, 3 to 1, even larger tree, 4 to 1, all the way up to super tree gets 6 to 1. So that number can't be calculated until we know how many trees are being removed, how many protected trees are being removed. So that only relates to protected trees that are approved for removal. Doesn't require it. And so when you're talking about a subdivision that might require, the number's been thrown out here, so that might require 300 trees to be removed, maybe only 50 of those are actually protected trees that would go by this mitigation schedule. And whether they plant on site or at an off-site location due to space constraints, they would mitigate at this rate. And the tree committee loves the idea of this for a couple reasons. What this does is it requires the developer, the builder, to produce a more accurate tree survey, because they're not going to want to have to mitigate for 28-inch and 36-inch trees if they only have to mitigate for 16-inch trees, right? Because it's going to save them money if they, and so they're going to give us a better tree survey. They're going to do a better job of analyzing the site before they build. And so it actually incentivizes the developer to save the larger trees and figure out a way for his or her road to go down a path that requires more smaller protected trees to go out rather than the big ones. So it actually incentivizes protecting more of our canopy. It's a bit, of a little bit of a math situation for Eric and for us, as we have to, it's not just a clear 3 to 1 anymore. But it, like I said, it incentivizes the developer to protect more of the largest trees, which we think is a good thing. Okay. Question for Eric, if you'll back up a couple slides. Back up to slide 1, please. Uh-huh. I was under the impression, and it may be the way I'm remembering that it's worded, that basically all oaks are protected oaks, other than the water oak now is off the list. Am I correct on that? Okay, all right. That was merely a question. I'm not arguing anything. Yeah. Okay, and on slide 3, I believe it is, the replacement tree cost. This is kind of a side note. I think it should probably be considered that, for instance, at the beginning of maybe every 2-year period or whatever, you figure out, okay, this is the average cost of a tree, $50, $100, whatever. It's not that, and then that's what we go by for X number of months, years, whatever. It's not that any tree that developer decides to plant, whether it's a bald cypress or a southern magnolia or a live oak, whichever one is on sale that week, and then he tallies those and multiplies that by 2. It would be a fixed cost based on an average market value. Does that make sense?
The way to come up with the value, I thought the easiest thing is, I'm gonna go buy a tree at JLC Landscaping in Woolman, and that's gonna be the base cost for a mitigation tree.
And if the,
Just going.
and if the tree was a live oak, you're going out to buy a live oak sapling. If it was a magnolia, you're going to get a magnolia. Gotcha.
And then another bit of confusion that I sensed as I heard your questions was the on-site versus the off-site mitigation. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this is definitely the way we understand it, and so if we don't understand it correctly, we want to know. Like you said, mitigation is mitigation. If they remove X number of trees, they have to mitigate at the rate according to the mitigation table. Whether they choose to mitigate on site because they have that available space, they can, but they can also opt to pay into the mitigation trust, at which time the city becomes responsible for the planting, the maintenance, the irrigation, the tracking, and the warranty for 3 years. And so it's actually a lot easier on the developer, because otherwise the developer actually has to pay for the planting, the irrigation, the maintenance, the tracking, the establishment for 3 years. And they fall off it falls off their radar pretty quickly because they're gone. They've already built their establishment. So this, the whole mitigation, the mitigation trust really ensures for our city that more of those trees that are required to be planted are actually planted now and cared for by somebody with the know-how and capacity to do it. The issue that the tree committee takes with that part of it, and I don't want to go into too much detail on that, but it is outlined here, is we seriously question whether the city has the capacity to do that. And we say that because the trees and the tracking of the trees, we have not seen good evidence that has been tracked. I mean, so as we've tracked it, the city is owed by developers many trees. And because there's, them planting it is not being reinforced. So I think that's definitely takes some revisiting of how are we actually going to do this.
Let me make a comment, is because I remember at the gas station, was it Murphy Oil, I think, that opened over there on Eisenhower Drive by the tracks several years ago. I think it was Murphy Oil. It's a gas station there where you turn to go to the big on CT Switzer there. I mean, they planted some trees and some crepe myrtles, and then there's a 2 or 3 year period where somebody's got to check them, and if those trees don't make it, they're supposed to plant replacement trees. So, I mean, that's the city's responsibility to do that, right? And I'm just thinking ahead, well, if we're going to see more mitigation and more trees planted, or a developer plants the trees, then it's still the city's responsibility to go check those trees. I don't know what the manpower required is, but it just makes sense to me. The more trees you plant, the more time it's going to take. I'll just leave it at that, just an observation. Go ahead, Tracy.
Okay. Let's see which point I want to address here. Oh, the other thing that is new to this ordinance proposal, and the, community development and the tree committee is in agreement with this, is in the past, there was no mitigation species requirement. It was just, am I correct that it was just, you got to mitigate 3 trees for the one you removed? And now it is, you've got to replace it with the correct number of protected species. So you can't just plant palms or crepe myrtles to take care of removing a live oak. You have to plant either a live oak, a bald cypress, or a southern magnolia to take care of any of the protected species that you remove.
Can I ask one question? And this probably will sound foolish to you, but is there any basis for that? Is there a scientific relevance to why it has to be an oak versus another tree?
Native, well, for one thing, just from a layperson's perspective,
Which I am as well.
which you are, and I am not,
Okay.
actually. And I don't mean that weird, but I just mean, just to say it from a layperson's standpoint, from the things I hear from the people in Biloxi that I've just heard from, we love our tree canopy. We love our native species. This is the heritage of this area. And so it's those live oaks and those magnolias and those,
So it's not scientific, it's just our preference.
well, that's from a layperson's perspective. But from a scientific perspective, native species will always establish easier in the landscape. They will require less care, less water. They attract native species of wildlife. They benefit our native soils. They thrive in our native soils, so it all works together.
But there's other native species that could be planted. It doesn't have to be a live oak for a live oak or whatever. If that's the logic, someone could plant some other species of tree that's native to, that's what, I was just asking, is there a scientific benefit? I get the being able to survive in the soil in the
So it's a balance, right? It's a balance of kind of a cultural perspective and a scientific perspective. So the cultural perspective would be, we want these large, trees replenished, and the scientific, melds in with that.
Well, thank you. And I didn't mean to belittle you, or I didn't want you to come across that I was offending you at all. I was just
No.
really
And I
curious
probably came across that
about
way.
that. And,
Sorry.
and I'm sorry, I don't want to offend anyone else, but I do have to go. I've got to close up my shop. Had this been a night meeting, I'd have been able to.
Councilman Deming, I think where you were going just a minute ago, I think you may have said it. I want to repeat it though. The question would be, if I have to take out 2 magnolia trees, can I plant 2 oak trees?
Yes.
I think so, but I think,
Before.
Well, I'm saying
Well,
mitigate. Can I
depending on the
mitigate-
size,
Could I
it may
mitigate
be-
with a different
It may
variety
be
of
6
protected
or
tree?
9 or, right.
but I
So
think before it may have been a function of cost. You could take out 2 live oak trees and put in 2, what's the 2 cheapest trees I can replace it with? And you get like 2 crepe myrtles or 2 cheap palms. So I mean, I think that's part of it too, I think, is getting the cost equalized to what's being taken away.
That's what happened with the Murphy Toll Station. They took down some water that was just in the parking lot, and they replaced them with crepe myrtles. I believe that was before, we held the right kind of legislation
Right.
for this. We have no objection to replacing crepe great problems with our drainage system. So is it a protected tree? Yes. Can somebody plant it if they want to? Yes. Do we encourage magnolia trees? Not necessarily. It depends on where it is and how close it's located to some of our drainage infrastructure.
Thank you. And again, I wasn't pushing for any changes. I was just asking that question for knowledge. That's all. But again, thank you guys for coming up here and explaining this. If you have a lot more, would you be willing to put it in an email and send it to me? So I don't want to miss anything, and be prepared for our meeting so we can discuss this and vote to approve or deny or whatever. I don't want to assume what's going to happen, but I do want to be well prepared for it. And
I
again,
would be happy to send you an email.
Thank you. Again, I apologize for leaving early.
And I intend to be brief on the next 2 points, but I would like to at least make those points so that if we need to carry on this conversation at another time, we can do that. Would that be okay?
By the last two items, you're talking about the last page, the last two items?
Well, I'm pretty sure I did not go in order, but yes.
Have we covered
Are not the last two. They are in the middle, but I already covered the last one.
okay. But have we covered everything that you wanted to cover?
I have 2 points I would like to cover.
Go ahead.
Okay. As we stated, the mitigation requirement in the past was 3-to-1. Now we're proposing it goes to this new table. But then an exemption was proposed that subdivision development of new single-family homes, that their mitigation requirement does not go by that table, but goes by a lesser ratio of just 1-to-1. And so it takes, for one thing, our point was to simplify the whole process and the language. And so it's taking that whole table and it's saying, this and this and this type of development, this table applies to, but then this other type, they just do 1-to-1. So everybody do the mitigation table. It applies to everyone. The subdivisions, and I'll go down this point by point. The subdivision development for single-family ratio residential is proposed to mitigate at a 1-to-1, and the tree committee is not in support of that. This benefits the developer for being liable, obviously, for the replacement of fewer trees. These are the tree committee's points on why this is not practical. This does not adequately replenish the native and important tree canopy. In particular, it's a lot of the folks in the Wool Market area that are raising voice and complaining about the loss of trees for subdivisions, and they would be the ones that would just continue to see that happen. Number 2, new development subdivisions are established then without aesthetic and environmental benefits of trees. Con number 3 would be this is an entirely different pattern of mitigation, which I already addressed. Number 4 would be this does not incentivize protecting native and the important and native canopy. So if you provide developers with an incentive, they'll do it. If you don't give them any reason to save our trees, they won't. The proposed policy sends a message of favoring one kind of development without requiring reasonable mitigation. And then does anybody have any questions on that point? No. And then the final point that we wanted to make is under the old policy, all applications for the removal of 5 or more species of protected trees, 5 or more protected trees, was to go to Planning Commission. 1 to 4 trees, and that's handled through the community development and the city arborist signs off on that. So the new language states that there is an exemption of new construction single-family residential subdivision development from this requirement. The problem with that is it creates a loophole for developers who go in through Planning Commission and get the approval to remove 300 or 50 protected trees, whatever it is, to plat out their subdivision. And then when all that is said and done, a couple years later, they become the builder. And this is I'm giving you a real scenario that happened within the last year, without naming names. And then the same developer comes in and serves as the builder of 5 of those lots. Am I right in the number of 5? Carol? It was 3 or 5 lots, or 10 lots, whatever. And they applied for permits to remove some trees they needed to remove on those lots in order to build homes. Not just any trees, but protected trees. And for each of those applications, there were 5 or more trees on each of those lots. One of them, there was over 10 protected trees on that lot, that one lot that they wanted to remove. Same person, same company that developed the property as a subdivision a few months or a couple years earlier. And so it creates a loophole for that to happen. So our argument is those subdivisions should be platted so that those, and the city, we can encourage developers to build this way. Those subdivisions can be platted so that the main clusters of trees, the protected trees, fall on property lines or near property lines so that there's still room for a home to be built without requiring, the homeowner to come in and buy that plot of land and have to take that to, community development and ask for that tree to be removed. So we take issue with that. In addition, those permits then, those projects would also not have to mitigate. So not only are they able to remove 10 protected trees, they don't have to replace them at any sort of a mitigation schedule. And so we take issue with those 2 points. And, we'd like you to consider those especially, and we'd like you to ask questions. That's all I have. Except for, thank you a lot for the time.
Mr. Creel, you have a comment?
Just very briefly, I want to respond to a couple of those
Okay.
things. The one thing that the ordinance already says is that this has got to be balanced. It has to be designed so that it's not all one way or the other. So the theory is to protect as many protected trees as possible without killing development projects, and we think that we've come up with a good ordinance. Now, I want to respond to a couple of things. Number one, the people in Wool Market that were referred to that complained about trees being removed, the trees being removed was actually just a part of the argument where the people that had lived in Wool Market did not want any development located next to them. And the trees gave them part of a valid argument to try to protest a subdivision coming in next door. The other side of that argument is that these subdivisions were developed and they're selling faster than they can build them. So there are some people who are looking for houses that are not surrounded by trees. The second part of it that has to do with the different lots that each had a separate application, that has to do with subdivisions that are developed in different phases. Sometimes when that developer, that engineer brings that project in, at that point they've only decided on the way that phase 1 is going to be designed. So they go ahead with that subdivision plat and they show these other plats as future development because they haven't designed those yet. And so when they come in with phase 1 of a subdivision development, it's looked at as an individual development. I go back to my original argument. I think that if this table is passed, that it's going to more than compensate with the commercial development that we have for the compromise that we're making on the number of trees in a subdivision development. We're going to be getting many more trees off of the commercial developments, the isolated commercial developments, that will more than make up for the removal of those trees in the subdivision. I think it's a very fair compromise. I think it's a common sense and good judgment compromise, especially if you understand the way development is done on a subdivision and the fact that they have to reshape the land and put in the infrastructure underneath. And sometimes those existing trees that have a root system on there, you cannot shape around those trees to protect those roots on it the way that it needs to be done. So that's our argument. I think that we've compromised with regard to the commercial tables, and I would hope that the tree committee would work along with us and compromise on the subdivision development as well.
One quick question.
Go ahead.
Have we, she mentioned about a loophole. Have we addressed those issues where the possibility of being compromised in certain areas, the loopholes that she was talking about?
Well, I think she is referring to the fact that those lots out there were separate lots, and that's what I was trying to address with the phasing of a subdivision development, because it doesn't seem to be an issue with the commercial developments. You know, when they come in with a site plan for their entire project, and it's already designed, and then we work with them through DRC to move the building around on the property, or maybe move the parking lot over to save more protected trees. That part is working. With the subdivision development, the only thing that we could do is to require the subdivisions to go ahead and completely design the entire plat from start to finish, so that everything is addressed at that time. Sometimes the developer is not ready to do that. And I'm sure that has nothing to do with whether or not they're going to have to cut down a few more trees. I think that has to do with the fact that we're going to go ahead and get phase one in because we've got the financing for phase one. And right now we don't have the financing for phase two. We have a general idea about the way that it's going to look, but we haven't reduced that to engineering designs yet. And whenever that happens, we will come in with that. There was one thing that wasn't mentioned that I think it's important to mention. When the developer comes in with his tree survey, actually the city arborist is scheduling a on-site visit with the tree committee to actually go out and walk the property. And I think that's important to understand, that nobody's being blindsided by this, that the tree committee has, under the ordinance now, can send a representative to the DRC committee to ask these questions in advance. They also, once the survey is generated, they also can meet with Eric out on the site to do a walking tour to look at the trees and discuss those things. So I think that's important for y'all to know as well.
All right, thank you. Yes, ma'am. Final comment, Tracy. If you would come up to the mic, please. Thank you.
Thank you. My only response to that is regarding the phases that Jerry was speaking to. All we're asking there is that those projects also, if there are 5 or more trees, they go through Planning Commission. That's what we're asking.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Creel. Thank you, Mr. Nolan. Thank you, Ms. Pizarich. Thank you, Ms. Wyman. Thank you, Ms. Campbell. Thank you, Mrs. Peterson, for being here today. And our computer operator in the tech department over there, Mr. Pizarich. First, I need a motion to table this ordinance for a second reading at the January 25th meeting. By Mr. Lawrence, a second by Mr. Guines. Any discussion? All in favor? It's approved on a 4-0 vote. Entertain a motion to adjourn. Thank you by Mr. Lawrence and Mr. Guines. All in favor? There you go. 3 little Indians left. All right. We're adjourned. Thank you.
Keith.